So today we're going to work on using relative clauses when summarizing a text passage with the visual support that includes common relative pronouns. So for our first activity, I'm just going to tell you about what a relative clause is. A relative clause tells about a noun like an adjective, and it usually follows the noun that it tells about. They can occur after a subject noun or an object noun, and they usually start with a relative pronoun, which could be that, which, who, whom, or whose. So for example, the boy who was walking across the street got splashed. The boy got splashed by the car that ran through a puddle. That ran through a puddle is the relative clause in the sentence. For activity number 2, we're going to do sentence repetition. So now we're going to read some sentences. I will read a sentence and then you will read the sentence. After you read, I will talk to you about the sentence's meaning and the relative clause adds to the information in the sentence. Let's start. The African slave trade, which occurred from 1942 to 1820, transported approximately 10 million Africans to the New World.
The African slave trade, which occurred from 1492 to 1820, transported approximately 10 million Africans to the New World.
So in the sentence, which occurred from 1942 to 1820 is our relative clause. It tells us when the African slave trade occurred and 10 million Africans were taken to the New World. We now know that the African slave trade occurred from 1942 to 1820, and 10 million Africans traveled to the New World during that time. Next, African traders and European merchants sold slaves to American planters who used the slaves on their plantations.
African traders and European merchants sold slaves to American planters who used the slaves on their plantations.
So in this sentence, who used the slaves on their plantations tells us what the American planters did with the slaves they purchased. The slaves were purchased by the American planters, and then the slaves worked on their plantations. Last, many African rulers who profited from the selling of slaves willingly participated in the slave trade.
Many African rulers who profited from the selling of the slaves willingly participated in the slave trade.
So in this sentence, who profited from the selling of slaves is the relative clause. This tells us that the African rulers made money when selling the Africans to be slaves. This tells us why they were willing to participate, because they were making money from the selling of Africans. Activity 3. We are going to read the passage below together. The passage is to promote fluent reading with adult support. So I will read expressively at a normal to slow rate while the student reads along out loud with them. If the student reads a word wrong and self-corrects, the clinician should pause to let the student join them again in reading aloud. In this session, we will identify the complex syntax in that next activity. So we'll start here and read it together. 4 slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, which was known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing experience. It was the second or middle leg in the triangular trading routes, linking Europe, Africa, and America. Men, women, and children, who were often did not survive the passage, were crammed aboard vessels as tightly as possible. Diseases such as measles and smallpox spread rapidly. About 1 slave and 5 perished before reaching the New World,
which they were sold.
Which they were sold. Ship captains who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics were known to throw the sick overboard. Okay, next. Using this paragraph that we just read, we're going to identify the relative clauses that were in the paragraph above. Here are some of the sentences from the paragraph. We need to find the relative clause. Remember that the relative clauses tells about a noun, like an adjective. It usually follows the noun that it tells about. They can occur after a subject noun or object noun, and it usually starts with a relative pronoun, such as that, which, who, whom, or whose. So let's look at this sentence together. 4 slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, which was known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing experience. So where do you think the relative clause is?
Which was known as the Middle Passage.
Yeah, good. Next, men, women, and children who were often did not survive the passage, were crammed aboard vessels as tightly as possible. What in that sentence would the relative clause be?
Who were often did not survive the passage.
Okay, next one. About 1 slave in 5 perished before reaching the New World where they were sold. What do you think the relative clause in this sentence would be?
Where they were sold.
Good job. Lastly, ship captains who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics were known to throw the sick overboard. What do you think the relative clause in this sentence is?
Who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics.
Yep, good, okay. So next is we're going to practice using relative clauses in our own sentences. To practice, I'm going to show you 2 sentences. You need to combine these sentences into one sentence that uses a relative clause. So I will do the first one. Almost 10 million Africans were sold during the African slave trade. The African slave trade refers to a 3-way triangular trade. Those are my 2 sentences, and I'm going to combine them using a relative clause. So in my new sentence, I'm going to say, almost 10 million Africans were sold during the African slave trade, which refers to a 3-way triangular trade. So my relative clause in this sentence is, which refers to a 3-way triangular trade. So I want you to do these sentences. The African slaves often got sick on the ships. The slaves frequently died during the trip to the New World. Can you combine the sentence using a relative clause?
The African slaves who often got sick on the ships frequently died during the trip to the New World.
Okay, good job. So we'll do one more. I'm going to have you do this one again. This sentence is, the African slaves came to the New World through the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage included Europe, Africa, and America. Can you combine those using a relative clause?
The African slaves came to the New World through the Middle Passage, which included Europe, Africa, and America.
Okay, and so in that sentence, what is your relative clause?
Which included Europe, Africa, and America.
Good job. All right, we have 2 more activities that we have to do today. The next one, I'm going to read a short passage with you, then I'm going to show you the same passage, but some of it will be missing. I need you to finish those sentences with the same information using a relative clause. Let's start now. Africans traveled the Middle Passage that was a triangular passage to the New World. Once in the Americas, the Africans were sold to their landowners who worked them on their plantations. Many slaves became sick on the ships, which were crowded with men, women, and children. So next is our passage that I need you to fill in the blank for. So, Africans traveled the Middle Passage that
was a triangular passage
keep reading.
To the New World.
Once in the Americans, the Africans who were sold to landowners who
worked them on their plantation.
So many slaves became sick on the ships, which
were crowded with men, women, and children.
Good job.